The best quality hybrid and traditional photo lighting and shooting videos are available for you at ShootSmarterUniversity.com. And they're less than $10 a piece, too.
Hello everyone, Paula Thomas here from Gapey's Grub, and I took a little bit of a break from shooting food photography, and I went to my first motocross race, and I brought along my Olympus OMD and a bag full of lenses. Now, I know most of you know that sports photography isn't really the mirrorless camera's strong suit. DSLRs still excel in that area, but I was able to get some pretty good results using two of my lenses, the Olympus 45mm and the Lumix 35 to 100mm. I started out with the 45mm and I did some panning shots, and the Olympus has the built-in image stabilization in the body, and it has 3 different image stabilization modes. One the horizontal, the vertical, and then it's got one that does both. I used the horizontal image stabilization mode to get my panning shots of riders as they whizzed by, and most of my shots were actually pretty in focus, and it wasn't too difficult to get some good panning shots, and I'll share a couple of those with you now. So that was one tip that I have if you're shooting with the Olympus and have the image stabilization in the body. Another thing that I learned is with focusing, if you're shooting something that is moving and going further away and closer to you, you're definitely going to want to use autofocus. And I don't use autofocus that often in my food photography. I'm always shooting manual because they're not, those things aren't moving. So I got to play around with the continuous autofocus on the Olympus, and it didn't always work as well as I would have liked. I didn't have too much problem getting the rider in focus as it was coming towards me and going by me, but then as it started going further away, it started getting out of focus and in focus. So that was a little bit of a challenge that I had. But definitely use continuous focus if you're shooting sports or any kind of moving objects. Now, the other challenge that I had was on getting my exposure correct. When the riders were doing jumps, I was trying to shoot up in the air, and obviously with the sky being so bright, and it was a really bright sunny day that day, it was hard to get the exposure right. I used the exposure compensation to get the correct exposure, and I had to take a couple shots to figure out what the best exposure would be. But there's a dial on the Olympus OMD that makes it really easy to change the exposure compensation to compensate for if it's too bright or too dark. One more thing I wanted to talk about is the focusing mode that I used. I almost always use spot focusing, and this wasn't any different. There was one part of the track where I was shooting riders as they were coming up a hill, and I moved the focus point so that it was down on the ground instead of in the middle as I would normally do, because if it was in the middle then it would start focusing on the trees. So on the Olympus OMD, they make it really easy to change the focus point, and sometimes I accidentally change it, actually quite frequently. But there's some arrow buttons that go up, down, left, and right on the back of the OMD, and if you just push one of those buttons, then it'll automatically move the focus point to that direction. I don't use the stereo microphone on the OMD very often, but I thought it would be really useful for a race like this, and it seemed to capture the audio of the riders pretty well and the motorcycle sounds. So here's a little snippet from the video that I put together showing some stills and videos from the race. I hope you enjoy it.
The best quality hybrid and traditional photo lighting and shooting videos are available for you at ShootSmarterUniversity.com. And they're less than $10 a piece, too.